If I had an ancient Israelite right here transported, beam me down, had an ancient Israelite right here to look at that, they wouldn't know what they were looking at. They would have no clue what this was a picture of, because they don't think about the world this way. We can look at this and we can interpret a lot of the things on it. It communicates to us. We know what it's reflecting. But an Israelite would have no idea what that was. They don't think about the world the way we do. And notice also that God did not tell them about this in order to communicate with them.
Welcome to the Belfast Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Byler, and me and Daniel are transitioning now from our talks on the canonization of the gospel to have more conversations about specific instances of really how time and place affect the Bible. We're starting here with Walton's talk he gave on the ancient Near East context of Genesis 1 and 2. I will split this up into two parts, and then we'll have a section on 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. And so in this first section, you'll hear the first half of our conversation and interaction with Walton's talk. I hope, as always, that you guys find it fruitful and nourishing and challenging. If you guys like what we're doing here, again, you can subscribe. You can leave us a comment. You can email me at belfastpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow us at the Belfast Podcast on Instagram. You can leave us a review on iTunes. And as always, we will see you in the next one. Excuse my sore congested throat and nose. I've been dealing with allergies or being sick for the past couple of days. Who knows what it is at this point? Missouri has gone from winter to summer to rain, back to summer, and now back to rain. So that's been the weather conditions as of late, and I don't think my body is enjoying it. But so that's just what's been going on in my life. As far as this podcast is concerned, a lot of what we've been focusing on as of late, just to do a recap, as is becoming tradition here. We've been talking, obviously, a lot about time, place, literature, and then we've transitioned into doing a lot of that with the biblical text itself, talking about how our views on what it means for the Bible to be inspired, to be a human and divine book, as Tim talks about. What does that mean in terms of the Bible happening in time and place? What does the making of the Bible or the compilation of the Bible, as we talked about with the New Testament canon and the Old Testament canon, how does that affect time and place? How does the interpretation that we do on the back end of having the whole Bible on our shelves or on our desks together in one codex, how does our role of knowing the time and place affect how we are to interpret then the Bible? What role does the Holy Spirit play or not play in that kind of interpretation? These are a lot of the questions we've been asking recently, and hopefully been giving some convincing answers on how the nature of communication, as Wright says so well, and something I harped on a few episodes ago, there's no other way to write. There's no other way to compile. Selection and arrangement. It is what you have. And again, to think that if God is truly concerned with communicating to us human beings, why would we expect it to be any different? Because something different would actually not be communication. It would be something that we don't understand. And that's not communication. So that's generally what we've been talking about here, an overview of time and place, communication, literature, the Bible, canonization, and then how do all of those factors play into us interpreting what is happening within the canon. Any comments on that, Daniel?
Yeah. One of the things that I think you brought up the right quote that you harped on a couple episodes ago, like you said, that I think is really, it's a good summation of everything we've been talking about, and a good way of framing thoughts when it comes to how do we interpret things, which is another thing that we've been talking about consistently. Excuse me. One thing that I think would be somewhat, I'm interested to see how this plays out today. I think both for us as we walk through the material today and for the listeners, I would say keep thinking about selection and arrangement, because we're going to talk about a story in the Bible that we usually think of as ex nihilo, out of nothing, and how that was actually more selection and arrangement than it was, in a modern sense, creation. So in looking at this language of selection and arrangement and then relating that to interpretation, I think it's also kind of funny that it appears as though, at least as the Bible portrays it, God was doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that may make some more sense later as we get into the material for today, but keep that in the back of your head, and hopefully I'll remember to come back to that. Selection and arrangement, not just in interpretation, not just in retelling stories, but as pretty fundamental to the way that creation itself is portrayed in the Bible itself.
Very well. We will definitely revisit those themes here in a little bit. I want to draw everyone's attention, just so that everyone knows that I'm aware of what's happening here. We did an episode in March, so a couple months ago, and I titled it, Putting the Bible in Its Place. Dune, Mackey, and Heiser help us understand divine accommodation. And so we're going to be hitting a lot of those same themes again today. Matter of fact, I'll be reading some things I read before again today. But in terms of what Daniel just said, and God doing selection and arrangement, also keep in mind, parallel to that thought, the conception of divine accommodation, as we talked about it, which has been the undercurrent of my whole summation that I had, my whole phrase of why would we expect it any other way? That is God divinely accommodating his communication to human beings. So with that being said, I know some of this, as with our conversation on inspiration and inerrancy, is going to be somewhat of a recap and an overview, and even a repetition of some of those same things. We're going to be looking at putting the Bible in its place again. We're going to be looking at a lecture from John Walton on the creation story in Genesis, about how does the time and place affect the telling of that story. We're then going to look at a New Testament example, examining a paper that I wrote last semester on 1 Corinthians 11 and Paul's conception of what is considered natural in that context, and how those pre-scientific thoughts about the human body played with his theological ideas, and when he discusses order within the church. And the argument we're basically going to propose today is that unless you understand the time and place in which these communications occurred, you aren't really going to grasp what is going on in the text itself. But we just wanted to go through these same themes again and give more versions of concrete examples to show how serious this hermeneutical exegetical art is.
Yeah, just to second that and maybe expand a little bit more. I've heard it said, I've had several people accuse me of saying something like, well, you're just saying that you can't understand the Bible without extra biblical knowledge. And a point that we've been making consistently is you can't understand communication without knowledge that is presupposed in that act of communication. So there's that. But building on that, I don't think that that's really even what we're saying about the Bible, right? Is that you can't understand it, or you can't understand what's most fundamental about Christianity as we are communicating and interacting with the text. In fact, one of the reasons we're revisiting this topic is because as we move forward, we're going to start nailing down on some more specifics. And so we want to recover this in as much detail as possible and as much as we think necessary. That way, as y'all are listening to us moving forward, you have this as a backdrop. So again, if it sounds like we're rehashing things, we kind of are, and we're expanding too, especially in the later half. There's going to be stuff we've never talked about before, maybe have referenced in passing, but never given a full and honest, good treatment. But again, back to the thing that I started with was, I don't think that you can't understand the Bible without this idea of like extra things. What I do think is definitely true, though, is it's the difference between, and I heard this on a podcast I was listening to recently called the Biblical Languages Podcast, but they talked about how it's the difference between standard definition TV and high definition TV. Do you want to see high definition Bible, or do you want to see low definition Bible? And the enrichment, that's the term that I've been using, the enrichment that it brings in understanding these things, I think is well worth the cost of a little bit of time, at least of people who aren't in this field of biblical scholarship and adjacent fields. It's well worth the time of practicing Christians to just listen and understand and absorb in trying to grasp the full high definition resolution picture that God is trying to paint in God's word, right? In his word, he's trying to say something. Are we doing the best we can to understand it? And sometimes I think that answer is no. And so here today, hopefully we'll take a look at two passages that can help you start to see things in a higher definition than before. Enrich your understanding of a passage. One of these is a passage that is thoroughly explored by other podcasts on the internet, and one of them is something that I've only heard touched on in maybe one or two other places. And so anyway, that's all I really have to say.
Okay. So to start, I'm going to start with what I started with in the episode I referenced earlier, putting the Bible in its place. So you could call this Putting the Bible in its Place Part 2. And that is the initial quote by Princess Irulan and Frank Herbert's Dune. Because I think it is such a helpful way to phrase what is going on here. She says this. Again, this is the first thing that you read when you open the book. A beginning is the time for taking the most delicate care that the balances are correct. This every sister of the Bene Gesserit knows. To begin your study of the life of Muad'Dib, then, take care that you first place him in his time, born in the 57th year of the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, and take the most special care that you locate Muad'Dib in his place, the planet Arrakis. Do not be deceived by the fact that he was born on Caladan and lived there his first 15 years. Arrakis, the planet known as Dune, is forever his place. From Manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
I'm ashamed you had to read that. You couldn't just quote it for me.
I'm close. I haven't referenced it recently enough for it to be like
That's
in the
fair.
front of my mind.
That's fair. I just remember last time.
I also wanted to make sure I got it right. You know?
Yeah, no, touche. I just remember last time you almost quoted the whole thing without looking at it. So anyway.
So with that being said, don't forget time, place, communication. What is being said? Who's communicating? How does that context infer and make what they're saying relevant to who they're saying it to? With all that in mind, let us jump into John Walton's talk on ancient origins and Genesis. This talk is one about the Genesis creation account. Walton gives an overview in the introduction about the perceived tension, much like Mackey talks about in his lecture on the perceived tension between science and faith. Walton says we're told that there's a war out there, but what is said on each side? This is something that Peterson speaks directly to in the clips we played from his class, where he says that the atheistic rationalist and the atheistic scientist and the religious fundamentalist have the same problem, because they assume that that different things are speaking of the same thing, which is scientific fact. And Peterson's conclusion is maybe we need two ways of looking at the world: what it's made of and how to act in it. And so very much the same thing here. Walton is saying, well, there's two sides to this debate that claim that they are talking about the same thing, and maybe the text of the Bible actually isn't giving us a scientific account, isn't a lab report on what happened when God created, and I'll put that in air quotes, alluding to what you said earlier about the world. So he introduces it like that, and then Walton moves on to an interesting discussion about time and place being tied to how the Bible is communicating its origins or its ideas of human origins. And he talks about authorship and intent, which ties to the episode that was just posted about interpretation, inerrancy, and inspiration. So I guess you can start, unless you want to say something else.
No, I don't think I have anything else to say. I'm sure something will come up later.
As if it is a modern text.
Scroll back just
if we're going to start
so we can
talking
catch
about
the
the Bible's claims, we need to start
Oh, you're good. That should bring us back for a moment.
About the text as an ancient document. It's not a bad thing that we want to try to see how the Bible fits into our modern questions, modern issues and concerns. That's not a bad thing, but it might be a little more problematic if we're thinking about the Bible as if it is a modern text. So,
Pause.
we're going to start talking about the Bible.
Don't forget that Mackey said the exact same thing.
And
the Bible is an ancient document.
Yeah. Well, and these guys are both, Mackey references John Walton a lot in his talks on that sort of stuff. But that's not to say that, Mackey's just agreeing with this guy, right? He's agreeing with the person who wrote the book on this. And not that necessarily writing a book gives you all the authority in the world, but John Walton is the guy. And he even, I don't know if we'll cover this in the time spans that we cover of this video. And as per usual, this video is worth anyone's time watching. So after you get done here, fill in the time slots we don't get to yourself, please. It's great. But at some point, he mentions how he used to be a young earth creationist because he thought that they were telling the same story. And it took him realizing, because he really genuinely cares about the Bible's authority and its demonstration of truth. But what he realized, what he said, made that switch for him is the realization that they're not actually talking about the same thing, which is what we're kind of covering today, is they're not talking about the same thing. What is the Bible saying if it's not saying scientific concordism? Ready?
Yes.
Bible's claims, we need to start right at the beginning and talk about the issue of biblical authority. How does that all work? Now, the way this is set up, and this is the way we've all learned about it, the idea is that God's purpose is carried out through human purpose. We've got a dual authorship going on here, human and divine. And God decided, apparently, since it's what we've got, God decided that he was going to communicate through particular human beings in a particular language, a particular culture, particular time and place. This was God's decision, and we really can't play.
Just hit the, if you just hit the direction arrows, there you go.
Apparently, since it's what we've got, God decided that he was going to communicate through particular human beings in a particular language, a particular culture, particular time and place. This was God's
time and place. Thank you very much, Dr. Walton. Anything to add?
No.
God's decision, and we really can't play Monday morning quarterback on it. This is the way he decided to do it. And so that means that if we're going to get to God's message, we've got to go through that author. Okay, that communicator, because that's how the transaction worked. And so we have this authority that's vested in a human author. It's not the human author's authority, it's the authority of God. But we have to go through that author to get it, and that means we have to understand what that author is communicating, because what he's got to say in his time and place, in his language, to his audience, that has authority. And that's what we need to get to. Now, through this, we come to understand that the Bible is written for us, but not to us. Boy, I say that so often you'd think I wouldn't stumble on it, but every once in a while I do. The Bible is written for us, but not to us. And by that we mean that the message transcends culture, but the form of it is culture-bound.
Pause.
And therefore,
I think that second point right there is essential. The message transcends culture, but the form is culture-bound. That's just good communication. This is also why I'm not a complete structuralist when it comes to language. Because then why else would we talk about the waterfall?
Yeah.
We're trying to communicate something even outside of our own cultural context that is a truth that we see in the world, or a pattern that we see in the world, or a symbol that we see in the world. Again, I always like to use another slightly different example just because I think it catches, we experience it more implicitly. When you watch a good movie or read a good book and you say, wow, that was amazing, that spoke to me, however you want to phrase that thing. Well, yeah, because the thing, the message, whatever that is, and I'm not using that in the way that the drinker uses it, but what is being communicated by the movie transcends the movie itself, right? Think about how I talk about dark, even in the episode previously where we talked about time and place in the Bible. Well, there's a lot of culture-bound things happening in dark because it is so German. But there's so many other things about the show that transcend its Germanness. But I'm going to miss so much because I have to watch it. Well, I like to watch it subtitled. I don't like to watch it dubbed. Because at the very least, I'm trying to get closer to what the author intended because I can hear how things are said. I can hear intonation. The lips match with, the sound that's coming out of the film, right? There's communication within the story itself, fictional or not, that's happening, that's set. That's why you talk about setting when you talk about a story. And the more realized, this is why things like Dune and Lord of the Rings are so foundational to their own genres, is because the worlds in which they occurred are so realized by the author. They feel like history or future in Dune's case. But because the world, because you feel the characters moving and doing and saying things bound in a particular place and time, then the communication makes sense. But then you can also extract from that things that are, as I have even done, relevant to other things going on in our current time and place. It's how communication, it's how storytelling essentially works. So yes, the message will transcend the culture. Any good communication is going to do that. But the form is always going to be culture or setting. I think might be even a better word, bound.
No, I agree. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's not good to be a pure structuralist, but it's also not good to be a pure relativist, right?
No.
Because the relativity assumes that there's no waterfall or that there's no hill. To use another Lewis example, where he talks about how someone has to walk down the hill and someone else has to walk up the hill, right? You can't do away with the fact that the hill is there. And you either have to walk up or walk down or walk around, because you
essentially
can't just
he makes a very
smooth the hill
pragmatic
over.
argument that there's a created world in which there's fixed limitation to the game, and that fixed limitation creates a playable game for human beings, is essentially his argument in the first two chapters of Problem of Pain.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes to Peterson's game, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he plays. You move first, and the other person says, "Well, I don't know what to do because there's no board, there's no cards, there's no pieces. What's the game?" He's like, "Exactly. Without some substance, without some structure, that we have nothing, and without any leeway or relativity at all, we can't do anything. We exist somewhere in the middle." So yeah, message transcends culture, but form is culture bound. I love that because it beautifully encapsulates basically the argument that we've been making and the argument that he's about to make with some greater points.
You can keep going.
We expect a message coming out of Scripture that we can all benefit from, that is sound theology and revealing God to us. We expect that message to be something that's meaningful to us. But the form of it is culture bound. And that means we've got a little bit of work to do. Because that means in order to get to that communication as clearly as we can, we have to try to join the audience, that original audience, and take our place there and hear it as they would hear it. We shouldn't expect that they're going to have the same questions that we have, the same issues that we have. They're not going to be approaching things with the same mindset. They are Israelites in the ancient world. They are not us. You know, when we look at the Israelite kings, we can't think Charlemagne or Louis XVI or Henry VIII. It's not that kind of kingship. They thought about kingship differently. When we read about cities in the biblical text, we can't think in terms of London, Paris, or Chicago. Jerusalem and Babylon are far different places. When we think about marriage in the biblical text, don't think love and romance, not that there wasn't anything like that, but marriage was not built that way. When we think about slavery in the ancient text, we shouldn't think about ethnic exploitation or the bigotry that comes with that, because that's not what slavery was then. We have to think about the world the way they thought about the world. Okay, and so we have to try to accommodate to that world, else we're likely to impose our way of thinking on the text, and without knowing it, distort the text.
Just a quick note on that. It is so easy to make that mistake, right? Because it's so natural, right? We have a way of thinking that we see as being natural to the world. And we think that the way that we think now is the way that it's always been thought and the way that it's always been done. It's not true in any sense of the imagination. The understanding of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 of the Christian fundamentalist in America, not even the Christian in Europe or the Christian in the Middle East or the Christian in Asia or the Christian in Africa or even South America today, but in the United States America, Christian fundamentalism, the understanding of those 3 chapters of Genesis is wildly different than it has been in a significant portion of Christian history. And for a significant portion of Christian history, that hasn't been a fundamental issue of Christianity, right? The fundamentalists made it a fundamental issue when certain cultural points became the touch point between Christianity and culture. And so
they were making it a completely culture-bound message.
Exactly. They were making a culture-bound message to a different time and place, culture-bound to their time and place. And you can have your interpretation of that text if you want to, right? That's fine. What I am saying, and what I hope the point that we drive home today is, don't let that deter you from understanding the real, okay, maybe not the real, the very purposeful message that the original author, as interpreted by John Walton, is getting at. Because the message that he brings from the text is far more impactful for our day in and day out lives than 7-day creation culminating with the 6th day of humanity being created and the 7th day of God resting. Right? Even that was a bit more generous of a description to the fundamentalists than I think they would even give themselves. So yeah, that point right there I think is crucial. Anything to add?
Mm-mm.
So we have to try to enter that world. Now, so we have to see the world the way they did. Here we've got our nice blue earth picture from space. If I had an ancient Israelite right here transported, beam me down, had an ancient Israelite right here to look at that, they wouldn't know what they were looking at. They would have no clue what this was a picture of, because they don't think about the world this way. We can look at this and we can interpret a lot of the things on it. It communicates to us. We know what it's reflecting. But an Israelite would have no idea what that was. They don't think about the world the way we do. And notice also that God did not tell them about this in order to communicate with them. He communicated in terms of their world and how they thought.
Divine accommodation.
Because he wasn't trying to reveal to them the ultimate cosmic geography.
Quick point on that. A lot of people, when I had this discussion with them, like to point to a verse somewhere in the prophets or the Psalms, I can't remember where, about how it's translated in English usually, which go back to the whole conversation we had on translation, and just copy and paste my thoughts about that here. But it's translated in English usually, you circumscribe the circumference of the globe. Mm-hmm. That is a very poor translation, because they didn't understand globe as we do, as we're about to get into. And circumscribe, sure, they're probably thinking about a circle, because if you go on to a tall mountain right now and you look out at the world, you see a circle, right? The horizon is cut in a circular shape. So yeah, they would have had an understanding of that. It wouldn't have been spherical necessarily, which is something we're about to get into. But they're looking at the world and they're understanding the world that they're looking at in very different ways than we are. And that's okay, because God isn't correcting their false perceptions.
False.
Yeah.
They're not even non-true, but they're incomplete pictures of the physical realities of the world.
Yeah. And we have all sorts of incomplete pictures of the physical realities of the world right now, I'm sure. I mean, you get 10 years out in science, 20, 30, 40 years, and we'll be correcting ways we've thought now and have thought for hundreds and thousands of years. And that's okay, because God's not here to just reveal to us all of those things. And I think the Bible is, by and large, communicating truths that are far more important than those things.
Yeah, it's super funny because of the cultural tension in the 1920s, the debate became about how does God reveal things about the physical world to us? Right? You had the whole German liberalism and evolution pushing on the church. Those are the two big things. And with the German liberalism came discussions about inerrancy and about the authority of the scriptures and things like that. But it's also interesting to put that kind of weight on the biblical text as God's, not necessarily how it might be said explicitly, but within that debate, what becomes primary in pulling from the text is God's descriptions of the physical world, which I don't think are ever really primary. And so to then put the pressure on it of, oh, well, this is really what God meant now because we can understand it, as him revealing truths about the physical nature of how things occur, is, again, it's such a modernist scientific question that I don't know if anybody else besides us in the West, and America specifically, even care about.
Well, and it's also relatively arrogant too, because it assumes that no one before us could have properly interpreted this text within a scientific framework and it made sense to them, right? Or they should have, all along, they should have used this as the foundation, right? Because they had been missing it for so long. And if only they had trusted the Bible. And I actually think that that statement is true, but I don't mean that in regards to scientific like descriptions of the world. I mean that in moral meaning driven descriptions of the world. Not that I think a substantial amount of the Bible is telling history as it happened. I would be, I guess, more conservative in that way than a lot of the people that I'm surrounded with, I guess, in my academic setting. But I also don't think that's the main issue being discussed or should be discussed. I also think that if that's ever made the main issue, you're missing the point.
And this isn't to discount science or understand how the physical world works or physics or geometry, right? No. Without any of those things, we wouldn't have bridges, we wouldn't have cars, we wouldn't have computers, all the things that I take for granted in my life as working. You know, I wouldn't have a camera, we wouldn't have the internet. Like, none of this would exist if we weren't concerned with how those things operated and even manipulating them in meaningful ways. So it's not to say that we're anti-science in a funny way, but just that putting that kind of pressure on this kind of text seems to be misplaced.
Greatly misplaced. I had more to say, but we'll get to it later. So
that all people of all time should now believe. a good thing because, of course, cosmic geography changes. Even in recent times, cosmic geography changes. I mean, it wasn't 100 years ago that people believed in a steady-state universe. And now Big Bang cosmology is all the thing. That's cosmic geography, and it changed. We used to think Pluto was a planet. Oops. Things change. I was at a conference about a year ago, and there was a UCLA astronomer giving a paper, and he said, you know why Pluto's not a planet anymore? No, tell us, please. He said, well, we found it, with all the improved technology, we found 300 plus other bodies right in the vicinity of Pluto that were exactly the same as Pluto. So we either had to add 300 or take away Pluto. And we couldn't do it to the school kids. They have to learn the names of these things. So it was an act of charity. Anyway, cosmic geography changes. So God didn't reveal cosmic geography for all time. Okay, now, so how did people think in the ancient world? See, that's the question we have to ask. How did they think about the world back then? Well, let's start with Egypt. The Egyptians, this is from an ancient tomb painting, and on your right is, my son's an artist, and so I get him to help me sometimes and draw pictures that kind of help me communicate things. So that's kind of a more modern rendition, but basically the same picture. I don't know about you, but that I get that more than this. But let's talk from this one here. This is a picture of how they viewed the world. This is the solid sky, the dome of the sky, stars emblazoned on her body. Her name's Nut, okay, and she holds back the waters above. That's all of these. That's the waters above. The solar bark is sailing across the skies. There's the sun god. And this, the sky is held up by the air god, Shu. And here we've got the earth god, Geb, prone across the bottom. The Nut and Geb used to be married. It didn't work out so well. But every once in a while they get hankerings to get back together. And so Shu's got a tough job kind of keeping them apart. But at any rate, you can see that their view of cosmic geography is filled with the gods. That's because we put into a cosmic geography those things which are most important to us. There's prioritization going on. What parts of it do you picture, and how do you picture them? And so we learn a lot by looking at someone else's cosmic geography. And so they've got the gods all through it. That's not a picture of the material cosmos, although it reflects kind of how they thought about the material cosmos, solid dome of the sky, stars emblazoned on the body. I mean, it reflects some of that, but it's really not intended to be a material picture. Okay, they didn't believe that if they walked too far, they would step on her toes or something. It wasn't that kind of way of thinking. But it's filled with the gods. Now, of course, the Israelites wouldn't have this kind of picture. Okay, how would the Israelites think about theirs? Unfortunately, they left us no tomb paintings, so we're kind of stuck producing our own. Again, I got my son to help me on this one. And we just really went through the biblical text and took all the things that were there and tried to reflect them in the picture. Now, here we've got the heavenly temple with its foundations on the waters above. We get that out of...
I want to make this reference to what he said earlier about this not being a rendition purely of the physical reality of the world, right? They didn't think that they were going to walk so far and step on her toes, but their picture of what is happening in the world is filled with the gods. Now, Daniel, if you can skip back really quickly just to the picture he throws up of the globe.
Of the globe?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, let me see.
I just want to still frame on the, yeah.
It was pretty far
You
back,
passed
right?
it.
I passed it.
Yeah, it's right around there. There, that's fine.
Okay.
So we have the picture of the globe, right? And what does that tell us about our thinking of how the world works?
I mean, it
Purely
tells us,
physical and
yeah,
natural causes.
yeah. Yeah, and we greatly, and this is probably something we won't get into with Walton, but that he addresses in the topic, but we bifurcate, we separate out between
Mm-hmm.
miracle and natural, right?
Mm-hmm.
Supernatural and natural. And one of the things that you can see with the Egyptian cosmology is that they don't, right? It's not.
No, the gods are literally controlling sections of how the world works.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always natural is supernatural. It's the same thing. They don't have that separation. And the Israelites didn't either. And so we prioritize naturalism and to a certain degree, atheism with the way we frame our world.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that we like framing our world this way isn't bad, right? It's good to understand the way the world works. But yeah, it's a very, very good point.
We have a purely naturalistic, physical, what do we call them? Laws of nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's not how the gods operate, it's just how nature is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
These are the phrases we use. Well, that tells us a lot about how we think about how the world works, and that it actually isn't interacting with spiritual forces or supernatural things. Here I am again using the language because it's how we talk about it, you know?
Yep.
So I
We
just want to make
can't.
that point that in these pictures, they seem really weird to us, but only because we have a purely physical and natural way in which we describe the world, which influences literally how we picture it.
Yeah. Well, and we can't take natural and supernatural and smash them together. They couldn't separate them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that's super important to understand is the Egyptians and the Israelites and the Babylonians and the Canaanites, they saw the world as entirely working the way that the gods or God had it working, had it set up to work. And any intervention of the gods was just a part of that working. That's why it's better to translate miracle as sign or wonder than miracle, because miracle, we have this idea of like supernatural occurrence. Sign or wonder is just a sign of the God working. It's less mystified and supernatural,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Can you skip ahead to 1730?
1730.
Yep, it's going to skip over the Israelite cosmology, but he just gives it the same example of those similar ways in which the Egyptians thought about the world, the Israelites did.
Yeah.
It was about
Yeah.
how the world was constructed to reflect, I think is a good word, what they saw as spiritual or non-physical realities.
Yeah. Well, and one quick point on this too, because I've tried to explain this to several people. And every single time that I pull up a picture like this, or I describe a picture like this, I get pushback and say, no, it describes the world like we envision it, more or less, right? And talking about the Bible describes the world the way we envision it, more or less. And it's really hard to push that point home. And at some point in here, Dr. Walton mentions like he and his son went through every depiction in the Old Testament of like how the world is and operates. And they tried to construct this image based on all of those references. This was very carefully done, not maliciously done, because again, Dr. Walton was a young earth creationist thinking of the globe for a while. This is how he sees the Bible portraying it now. We'll get into why later.
Now, if the Israelites thought about the world around them something like that, we have the important question to ask. When God communicates to Israelites, whose cosmic geography does he use? Do we expect God to use our cosmic geography? If so, would he count Pluto as a planet or not? You know? Did he use medieval cosmic geography, Hellenistic cosmic geography? How about the cosmic geography of 100 years from now when we get smarter? And no, because cosmic geography always changes. There is no right cosmic geography. And so God just uses theirs. He communicates in terms that are familiar. Not to put a stamp of authority on this cosmic geography, but because you've got to use something to talk about.
And here again comes the point. Is God trying to communicate the reality of the cosmic geography, or is the point of the story something different, and the cosmic geography is the tool being used to communicate that point? Right? That's the debate here.